The fluorescent lights hummed their mechanical song at 2:13 a.m. Sarah Chen moved through the ICU at Oak Creek Memorial with the quiet efficiency of someone who'd learned long ago that invisibility was survival. Her scrubs were standard issue, pale blue, rumpled from a 12-hour shift that still had 4 hours remaining. The denim jacket draped over her shoulders was outdated, fraying at the cuffs, but she wore it regardless of the hospital's thermostat set deliberately high. Nobody questioned it. Nobody questioned much about Sarah Chen. She stood at the supply cart, restocking 4 bags with mechanical precision. 14-gauge angiocath needles. Saline flushes. Alcohol prep pads. Her hands moved through the inventory with the controlled deliberation of someone managing something far more dangerous than nursing supplies, the constant low-level tension of a body trained for extraction operations in places that didn't exist on maps, now confined to fluorescent corridors and beeping monitors. She counted as she worked. 4 counts in. 4 counts out. The breathing pattern of someone who'd held a 7-year-old boy's intestines inside his body while mortars fell on Marjah, keeping him alive through sheer will and hands that knew exactly where every critical artery ran. That was 20 years ago. Another life. A life that had been officially erased. The ICU ward stretched out around her, 12 beds, 8 occupied, monitors casting their pale blue glow across sleeping patients and the occasional nurse who didn't mind the graveyard shift. Sarah preferred nights. The attending physicians rarely appeared before dawn. The day shift nurses had stopped trying to include her in their break room conversations after she'd answered their small talk with single-word responses for 3 months straight. She was efficient. She was quiet. She was exactly the kind of employee hospitals wanted, competent enough not to complain about, invisible enough not to promote. She pulled a patient chart from the rack at bed 7. Marcus Williams, 68, post-operative day 3, recovering from abdominal surgery. The nursing notes were routine. Vital stable. Pain management adequate. Intake and output balanced. She scanned the equipment charges listed on the ICU billing summary attached to his chart. Ventilator support, standard. Cardiac monitoring, routine. But there a line item that didn't match the clinical notes. Equipment charge, $47,000. Listed as advanced diagnostic imaging apparatus rental, 72-hour period. Sarah's eyes narrowed. She knew this hospital's equipment inventory. She'd been restocking supplies for 8 months. She pulled up the maintenance logs on the ward computer, her fingers moving across the keyboard with the same careful precision she used for everything. The search took 90 seconds. No advanced imaging equipment had been brought into this room. No imaging apparatus. No additional diagnostics beyond the standard monitor. She closed the file. Returned the chart to the rack. Continued restocking supplies with the same mechanical rhythm as before. But something had shifted. The kind of shift that happened when you noticed patterns nobody else bothered to check. She'd worked in military field hospitals where every supply was accounted for to the nearest bandage, where waste was measured in lives lost. Phantom billing codes didn't exist in those places. They couldn't. But here, in the civilian world where she was supposed to be invisible, they apparently flourished. By 4:15 a.m., Sarah had cross-referenced 3 more charts. For phantom charges totaling $186,400 in equipment rentals that appeared on billing summaries but nowhere in clinical documentation or equipment logs. She sat at the nurse's station, the ward quiet except for the soft beeping of monitors and the distant hiss of a ventilator. The antiseptic smell, that hospital-specific combination of bleach and something chemical she'd never quite identified, hung heavy in the recirculated air. She would have to report it. Protocol required it. The day shift charge nurse would escalate to administration. There would be an investigation. There would be paperwork. Sarah had learned to hate paperwork, though she'd never explained why. Paperwork meant documentation. Documentation meant records. Records meant her name appearing in places official people might search if they were looking for someone who was supposed to be dead. But the alternative was saying nothing. Letting the phantom charges continue. watching people's medical costs inflate for services they never received. That was a different kind of death, slower, systemic, the kind that killed institutions from the inside. She made her decision at 5:48 a.m., as the ICU began its quiet transition from night to early morning. One of the other nurses, Jennifer, kind face, 2 kids at home, arrived early to prepare for day shift. Sarah pulled the billing documentation into a folder and set it on the desk in front of her. Then she waited, breathing in that controlled 4-count pattern, for Dr. Sterling to arrive for rounds. He entered at 6:22 a.m. like he owned the floor. His shoes, Italian leather, probably $800, clicked against the linoleum with a sound like a metronome. Sterling was 53, silver-haired, with the confident carriage of someone whose father had been a surgeon and whose grandfather had been a judge. His white coat was pressed sharp enough to draw blood. His name was embroidered on the chest in script so fine it barely caught the light. He didn't glance at Sarah as he passed the nurse's station, moving instead directly to the first bed, already beginning his verbal rounds before he'd even examined the patient. Sarah waited. She'd learned patience in extraction operations where 1 second of impatience meant everyone died. 2 minutes became 5. Sterling finished his rounds on the eastern side of the ICU. 8 patients. 8 charts. 8 clinical assessments delivered in that particular tone physicians used when they were certain everyone in the room was slightly less intelligent than themselves. When he passed the nurse's station again, she spoke. Her voice was soft, deferential, the careful tone of someone requesting a favor from someone infinitely more powerful. "Dr. Sterling, I apologize for the interruption. Could I ask about a billing discrepancy I noticed?" He stopped. His eyes landed on her with the particular quality of someone suddenly noticing the furniture in a room he'd walked through 1,000 times. 48-year-old woman. Asian. Outdated scrubs. The kind of nurse who never requested time off, never complained, never required his attention. He saw her the way he saw the supply carts and the waste bins, functional, unremarkable, beneath the necessity of extended eye contact. A billing discrepancy, he repeated, his tone suggesting the concept was faintly amusing. "On the ICU charges," Sarah said, sliding the folder across the desk. "Equipment rentals that appear in the summary billing but aren't listed in the clinical documentation or equipment logs. For patients over the past 3 weeks." Sterling picked up the folder with 2 fingers, the way someone might handle something mildly unpleasant. He opened it. Scanned the first page. His expression didn't change, no concern, no surprise, no trace of alarm. Instead, a small smile appeared at the corner of his mouth. The smile of someone who had just seen something confirming a suspicion he'd held all along. "Which shift were you working when you compiled this?" he asked. "Night shift," Sarah said. "I noticed the discrepancies while restocking supplies." "So you have access to patient charts and billing systems?" "Only the ward summary," Sarah clarified. "For inventory coordination." "Of course," Sterling said, closing the folder with deliberate slowness. "And it occurred to you to investigate further? To cross-reference documents? To compile a comprehensive report?" There was something beneath his words that Sarah recognized immediately. Not anger. Not even defensiveness. He was pleased. The smile widened slightly. "I thought it should be escalated," Sarah said carefully. "To ensure accuracy." Sterling held the folder for 3 seconds without speaking. The silence stretched like a pulled elastic band. Around them, the ICU continued its morning routine, monitors beeping in their algorithmic rhythm, the distant sound of a patient call light, the rattle of a supply cart being restocked in the hallway. "You know what I think," Sterling said finally. His voice was conversational, almost warm. "I think you've done excellent work here. Thorough. Attentive. The kind of care to detail that actually matters in a hospital." He paused. "But I also think you're the kind of person who asks questions about things that don't directly concern her patient care responsibilities." "These do concern patient care," Sarah said. Her voice remained soft, controlled. Billing accuracy affects insurance coverage. Coverage affects treatment access. Does it? Sterling said. Not a question. He set the folder down in front of her, but his fingers remained on it, pinning it to the desk. Well, I'll certainly look into this. That's very thoughtful of you, Sarah. He said her name like he was tasting something bitter. Very diligent. We don't see that kind of initiative very often in the ICU night shift. He released the folder and walked away, his Italian shoes clicking back down the hallway toward the physician's lounge. Sarah sat very still. 45 seconds of not moving. 50 seconds. The breathing pattern unchanged, 4 counts in, 4 out, 4 in, 4 out. Jennifer appeared beside the desk, carrying a stack of charting materials. Everything okay? She asked. Fine, Sarah said. Just a billing question. But it wasn't fine. She'd seen that smile before, in a different context, in a different country, on the faces of people who'd just realized they were about to have a problem they could handle. The cafeteria at Oak Creek Memorial on Thursday morning smelled like burnt coffee and institutional eggs. 7 a.m. 20 staff members crushed around 2 tables pushed together, nurses still in yesterday's scrubs, residents with the hollow eyes of people who hadn't slept in 36 hours. Sarah stood near the coffee station with her breakfast tray, watching Dr. Sterling move through the crowd like he owned the oxygen in the room. Morning, everyone. Sterling's voice carried the particular confidence of a man who'd never been told no. I want to conduct a little experiment about institutional culture and new hire retention. He gestured toward Sarah without using her name. The gesture itself was a dismissal, the kind you'd use pointing at a mop in a supply closet. I'll bet a week's salary. He paused, letting the amount settle. A week's salary was $800. That the new girl quits before Friday. Any takers? Laughter rippled across the table like a wave. Someone laughed hard enough to snort coffee. A resident grinned like he'd just been invited to something exclusive. Sarah took one measured breath and looked at her eggs. They were still warm. That detail mattered, though she couldn't have explained why. Warmth. Life. Things that stayed intact if you didn't let them be scattered. Sterling continued talking to the group, his tone conversational, as if Sarah wasn't standing 8 feet away. I mean, she's been flagging billing codes like she's the fraud police instead of doing actual nursing. Phantom equipment charges. Phantom staffing line items. The woman thinks she's discovered organized crime because someone miscoded a patient meal plan. He walked toward the coffee station. Toward Sarah. His shoulder was relaxed. His jaw was relaxed. A man approaching a minor inconvenience. What she doesn't understand, Sterling said, is that hospitals run on systems within systems. Sometimes those systems need flexibility. Sometimes that flexibility requires decisions made at levels above her pay grade. He was 3 feet away now. 2 feet. His tray bumped hers as he passed, not hard, deliberate in its casualness, the kind of collision that looked accidental to everyone watching. Her breakfast scattered across the tile floor. The plastic fork skittered under a table like a small animal fleeing. The cup tipped and rolled, stopped by a chair leg. The soup spread in a beige puddle that smelled like chicken broth and salt. The cafeteria went completely still. Oops, Sterling said without turning around. Sarah knelt to gather what was left. Around her, no one moved to help. That was the point. Help would be a statement. Silence was safer. She understood this instinctively, the way prey animals understand which predators are hunting and which are just passing through. A patient chart landed at her feet, pages spilling out, the edges fanning across the tile beside the soup puddle. Sterling stood directly above her now, close enough that she could smell the cologne, something expensive, something that probably cost more than her monthly rent. Pick that up, sweetheart. His voice was the same tone you'd use to give directions to someone who doesn't speak the language. Seems you're better suited for cleaning than critical care. Maybe we should explore whether your credentials were ever actually verified, or if the temp agency just sent warm bodies this week. Sarah remained on her knees, gathering the scattered chart pages. One of them had a patient's full name and diagnosis. She turned it face down. The fluorescent lights above hummed their tired frequency. A heart monitor beeped from the ICU, barely audible through the cafeteria doors. She counted 6 seconds of silence. 7. 8. Then she stood. Her movements were slow. Deliberate. The way a sniper rises from a concealed position, nothing wasted, nothing panicked. She held the wet chart pages in both hands. One page had a coffee stain shaped like a continent. Another page was starting to curl from the moisture. Sarah looked at Dr. Sterling. Direct eye contact. Steady. A single tear had escaped down her left cheek during the kneeling, not from pain, not from humiliation, but from the sheer compression of 20 years, from muscle memory activated by shame that wasn't hers. She didn't blink. She didn't wipe it away. Instead, she let him see it while her voice remained absolutely level. The only thing I'm cleaning up, doctor, is the mess you've made of patient care. Her voice carried a quality that made 3 residents look away. It was the kind of calm that comes from having already survived the worst thing that could happen to you, from having already lost everything that mattered, from knowing with absolute certainty that you had nothing left to lose. It was the calm of someone who'd once held a 7-year-old boy's intestines inside his body while mortars fell on Marjah, while the world exploded in a language that had no words, only noise and blood and the weight of a child who'd stopped crying because crying was pointless. Sterling's smile hardened. Not broke. Hardened. Like a stone wall receiving impact. He'd been prepared for tears. For anger. For a woman who'd apologize and gather her things and leave. He wasn't prepared for a woman who stood there drenched in cafeteria floor debris, holding a ruined patient chart, and looked at him like he was already over. You're done, he said flatly. Not yet, Sarah replied. She set the wet pages carefully on the nearest table. But you are. She walked out of the cafeteria without another word. The coffee station door swung shut behind her with a pneumatic hiss. The room didn't erupt. It didn't resume normal conversation. It sat in that quality of silence that comes when people realize they've just watched something they didn't understand. Sterling stood holding his coffee cup, watching the door where she'd disappeared, and his expression shifted, not to anger, but to something colder. Calculation. The look of a man who'd just realized that he'd misjudged the threat level. That afternoon, Sterling paged her to the ICU for a chart review. He'd requested it officially, through the nursing director. Sarah stood in the critical care unit while Sterling walked her through 6 patient charts, stopping at each one to correct a nursing note that was actually perfect, to question a medication documentation that was already double-checked, to suggest protocol violations that didn't exist. He did it in front of the attending physicians. He did it loudly enough for the residents to hear. He did it with the precision of someone laying groundwork. Clipboard Sarah here seems to have some confusion about chain of command, Sterling announced to the room. Every concern you have goes through your charge nurse first. Not directly to administration. Not directly to the billing department. You understand the difference between reporting and escalating. Sarah didn't answer. That was the composure move. The silence was the weapon. But Sterling wasn't finished. By Wednesday morning, he'd scheduled a meeting in the nursing director's office. Sarah sat across from Chen, no relation, who looked genuinely uncomfortable holding a personnel file that had been empty that morning and now contained 3 printed pages. Dr. Sterling's raised some questions about your credential verification, Margaret said, not meeting her eyes. He says your employment history has some gaps. Significant gaps. Where? Sarah kept her voice level. He mentions that your references for 2003 through 2008 are vague. They list you as unavailable for comment during that entire period. Margaret adjusted her glasses. That's a 5-year gap in your work history. For a medical professional, that's significant. Through the office window, Sarah could see Sterling in the hallway, arms crossed, shoulders relaxed, watching the scene like a man checking his email. Satisfied. Not worried. Not excited. Just satisfied that the machinery was moving in the right direction. Those references are accurate, Sarah said. Well, Dr. Sterling thinks the temp agency may have not done their due diligence. He's recommending we do a full investigation of your background before renewing your contract. Margaret paused. I'm sorry. I don't like this either. But a physician raising credential concerns is something we have to take seriously. Sarah stood up. May I ask what specific credential is in question? Your employment authorization. Margaret looked genuinely sorry now. He's suggesting you may have misrepresented your availability to work during that 5-year period. He's talking about reporting it to the state board. The words hung in the air. Reporting it to the state board meant an investigation. An investigation meant a paper trail that led directly to classified information that Sarah had no legal right to discuss, no way to explain, no avenue to contest. It meant that if anyone asked the Navy about her service record between 2003 and 2008, the Navy would confirm that no such record existed, followed by a very quiet phone call to her, reminding her of the terms she'd signed. Sarah walked out of the office without another word. She didn't slam the door. She didn't run. She walked down the hallway the way a soldier walks away from a briefing, spine straight, eyes forward, already 3 steps ahead of where she was standing. But that wasn't the worst part. Thursday at 2:53 a.m., she was alone in the ICU, reviewing midnight vitals, when alarms screamed through the unit like they were calling down the sky. A new admission had arrived 6 minutes earlier, unconscious, vitals already struggling. She heard the code called out over the intercom. Trauma Bay 2. Army personnel. Critical condition. Sterling was on call. She heard him responding before she did, his voice already in the ICU, already moving toward the admission bay. By the time Sarah reached the room, he was already there, leaning over the patient, barking orders at the attending physician. The patient was 27 years old. Male. Bearing the particular scars of someone who'd lived through something most people didn't survive. His left shoulder carried a puckered exit wound. His right hand was missing 2 fingers, healed over with precise surgical scars that spoke of competent battlefield medicine. His face was harder than it had been 20 years ago, defined by geography and loss. But it was the same face. Sarah stopped moving. For just 1 second, she stopped moving. It was Marcus Webb. The boy. Except he wasn't a boy anymore. He was a general. An Army Ranger general, based on the collar insignia and the way the staff moved around him with a particular deference. But it was the same person. Impossible and certain. Like watching someone come back from the dead. BP dropping, the attending called. 84/42. Pressures not responding to fluids. Pulmonary embolism, Sterling announced. Prepare for anticoagulation protocol. Get me heparin drip, 80 units per kilogram. That's wrong, Sarah said. The room went completely silent. Even the monitors seemed to lower their voice. Sterling turned. His expression was already hardening into anger. Nurse Chen, you're relieved from this code. Post-op vitals in the medical ward. Now. Cardiac tamponade, Sarah said, stepping forward. Not PE. Look at his JVD. His neck veins. The pressure differential. You anticoagulate him, you kill him. I'm the attending physician here, and I don't need. You're the antagonist, the attending said carefully, but she's right. Look at the echo findings from his intake. Pericardial effusion. Significant 1. Webb's monitor alarm escalated. 78. 75. The numbers dropping like someone cutting a rope. I'll need a pericardiocentesis, the attending continued, moving toward the crash cart. Emergency needle decompression. Someone get me a 14-gauge needle. Sterling grabbed Sarah's shoulder hard enough that her arm went numb. If you move 1 inch toward that patient without my explicit written order, you're done at this hospital. Terminated. Blacklisted. Police escort. Do you understand what I'm saying? Sarah looked at the general's face again. 20 years. An entire lifetime compressed into the space between one heartbeat and the next. She looked at Sterling's hand on her shoulder, felt the pressure of his fingers, understood the weight of the threat. She understood what happened if she moved. She understood what happened if she didn't. Webb's pressure dropped to 60/40. The attending was prepping the needle, but his hands weren't quite steady. He'd been a resident for 3 years. This kind of emergency procedure, this kind of stakes, it wasn't routine. It wasn't practiced. He was looking at Sarah like he wanted permission. Like he needed someone else to confirm what he was seeing. Sarah took one measured breath. Then she stepped past Sterling to the crash cart. Her movement was smooth, practiced, the kind of movement that came from 500 hours of combat medicine in places with names like Sanjin and Kandahar and Marjah. She identified the anatomical landmarks on Webb's chest with the muscle memory of someone who'd done this procedure with her hands shaking and enemy fire falling around her like rain. Her hands weren't shaking now. "If you touch that patient," Sterling said, "you're fired." She was already holding the needle. The attending watched her, saw something in her face that made him step back, not in fear, but in recognition. The recognition of someone watching a professional take over from an amateur. "Code blue," someone called. Flat line on the monitor. The lines going absolutely straight, absolutely still, absolutely final. Sarah didn't hesitate. The monitor's first scream came at 02 for 7 hours. 3 short bursts, then a constant wail that turned every head in the ICU. Code blue in Bay 7. Sarah's hands knew before her mind caught up. 12 years of muscle memory doesn't wait for conscious thought. She was moving before the attending physician even stood. The stretcher burst through the double doors like it had been fired from a cannon, 2 paramedics still compressions deep in the patient's chest, sweat dripping onto his face. The man on the gurney was built like a wall. Military bearing, even unconscious. Even coding. The attending, Dr. Martinez, decent clinician, competent enough, called out vitals as they wheeled in. "Massive PE, we've got an EKG showing right heart strain, oxygen sat dropped to 68% in the ambulance, blood pressure 74/41 and crashing." The medical jargon flowed like a rehearsed script. Protocol. The standard response to a pulmonary embolism. Blood clots in the lungs. Standard treatment. Standard crisis. But something was wrong. Sarah watched the patient's chest compressions and felt the wrongness like a pressure change before a storm. The way his neck veins were distending. The way his belly was swelling. The grey-blue tint that said perfusion failure, not just lung failure. The way his pulse was absent but his carotid showed barely a flicker of backflow. Cardiac tamponade. The diagnosis hit her the way it always did on the battlefield, sudden, complete, absolute. A feeling that became a knowing. Someone had pericardial fluid pooling around the heart, crushing it, preventing it from filling. The heart was being strangled by its own sac. Every compression, every breath, every second was squeezing the life out of him faster. She stepped to the patient's right side. Moved the compression nurse aside with a single glance. Step back. The attending didn't look up. "We need another round of epi, he's still." Wrong diagnosis. Sarah's voice dropped exactly 1 octave. Tamponade. Emergency pericardiocentesis. Now. Martinez's eyes snapped to hers. "We don't know that. The EKG shows. The EKG shows right heart strain because the heart can't fill. Not because of the clot. Look at the JVD. Look at the belly. He's not hypoxic. He's exsanguinating into his pericardial sac." She was already pulling supplies. The confidence in her voice wasn't arrogance. It was the sound of someone who'd made this exact call in a concrete bunker while mortars fell, and been right every time. The door opened. Dr. Sterling. He took one look at the chaos and moved to Martinez's side. His presence had the quality of something that changed air pressure, the weight of institutional authority, the kind of power that came from knowing which board members owed him favors. He'd been in the hospital since 0400 hours, already on his phone, already setting things in motion. He hadn't slept. The caffeine in his bloodstream had turned his movements sharp and angular. "What are you doing?" His voice was ice across glass. "Saving his life," Sarah said. "Get me a spinal needle. 18 gauge minimum. Sterile gloves. And a syringe. You are a registered nurse. You do not perform invasive procedures." Sterling's voice had teeth. "Step away from the patient." Sarah's hands didn't stop moving. She was already scrubbing the insertion site with chlorhexidine, the sharp chemical smell filling her sinuses like muscle memory itself was tangible. The skin was cold and clammy under her fingers, skin that was shutting down from the inside out. She had maybe 4 minutes before the heart gave up entirely. Attending physician should be calling this, Sterling continued, his phone already in his other hand. "Martinez. Get her away from the patient." Martinez looked between them. He was young enough that hierarchy still meant something. Experienced enough to know something was desperately wrong. The indecision on his face lasted 2 full seconds, an eternity in code time. Sarah didn't wait for permission. She never did. Permission was a luxury for people whose decisions didn't determine whether others lived or died. She felt the spinal needle in her hand. Someone had put it there, one of the ICU nurses, a young man named Cooper who'd seen her move and understood. The needle was 22 gauge, smaller than ideal, but it would work. Everything worked if you had the right hands and the right knowledge. She found the space between the 4th and 5th ribs, midclavicular line. The anatomy was the same on every human body. The pericardium was the same. Fluid pooled in the same patterns. She'd done this before in operating theaters with blood on the walls and the smell of cordite in the air. The needle went in. "Security," Sterling said into his phone. "ICU. Bay 7. I need immediate removal of a staff member performing unauthorized procedures." The needle punctured tissue. Cartilage. Then the give of the pericardial sac. Blood came back in the syringe. Dark. Old. 60 cubic centimeters of it, pressure relief, decompression, the heart suddenly able to fill, suddenly able to pump. The monitor's screen changed pitch. Dropped. Found rhythm. Blood pressure 90/60, someone called out. Then 95/65. O2 sat climbing. 72, 76. 79. Sarah withdrew the needle. Pressure dressing. Her movements had the precision of a clock. Every gesture economical. Every breath controlled. The trembling wasn't happening. The fear wasn't happening. The thing happening was old, practiced muscle memory layered on top of younger, deeper survival instinct. The patient's eyes flickered. Didn't open. But the flutter said consciousness was still in there, the brain still getting blood, still getting oxygen. "Sinus rhythm," Martinez whispered. "Like a prayer." Sterling was 3 feet away, phone still in his hand, watching her with an expression that cycled through anger and something else. Something worse. The moment a man realizes that the thing he's trying to destroy might be stronger than he is. "You just committed a criminal act," he said quietly. "Practicing medicine without a license. Assault. Procedural violation. I have witnesses." He gestured to the 2 nurses who'd been standing at the monitor, both of whom suddenly found the ceiling very interesting. "I'm contacting hospital legal. And the nursing board. You're finished at this facility." Sarah pulled the pressure dressing tight. One last check of the patient's respirations. The chest was rising and falling with mechanical precision now. The monitors showed what monitors should show, a heart that was beating, a body that was surviving. She didn't look at Sterling. She was already moving toward the medication station, her hands reaching for antibiotics, dressing supplies, the infrastructure of survival. The attending could handle the rest now. The diagnosis was made. The immediate threat was resolved. What happened next? The clot management, the cardiac monitoring, the post-procedure care, that was standard protocol, and Sterling's attending team could execute it. But that wasn't the worst part. At exactly 0312 hours, 2 security officers appeared at the ICU entrance. Sterling must have made a second call while Sarah was working. They moved toward her with the mechanical certainty of people following orders. Sarah was washing her hands at the sink. The water was cold. The soap smelled like the same antiseptic that had cleaned blood off her hands in field hospitals in Helmand Province, in tents where the surgical lights ran on generator power and every patient had a story that ended in either survival or addition to a body count that the Pentagon would never officially acknowledge. She didn't resist. Resistance would be argument, would be emotion, would be giving Sterling exactly what he wanted, evidence that the protocol violation had upset her, that she understood the severity of her transgression. Instead, she dried her hands on paper towels and turned toward them with the composure of someone who'd already survived worse things than this. "My badge?" she asked. "Deactivated," one of them said. He was older. Uncomfortable with this. The other one was younger, just following procedures, just doing the job. They walked her out of the ICU at 0318 hours. Past the nursing station where her colleagues pretended not to see her. Past the supply closet where she'd changed into her scrubs 12 hours ago. Past the waiting room where families had been praying all night. The parking lot was dark. Rain had started, not hard, just a persistent drizzle that smelled like wet asphalt and the promise of morning. By 0545 hours, Sterling was in the hospital president's office. He had documentation ready. He had the attending's initial assessment showing deviation from protocol. He had 2 security officer statements and testimony from nurses. He had a narrative that framed Sarah Chen not as a hero, but as a security liability, as someone whose background check had revealed suspicious gaps in employment history, as someone who'd acted outside her scope despite multiple warnings. By 0625 hours, he'd made 3 phone calls to board members. By 0700 hours, he'd contacted the temp agency that had placed Sarah, already requesting her removal from the system. By 0745 hours, an investigator was being dispatched to review her file, to understand those gaps, those missing years, those redacted military records that didn't make sense. By 0900 hours, Sarah was being escorted from the hospital by 2 different security officers. Her locker was already being emptied. Her belongings were already in a cardboard box, the small personal things that float around a workplace long enough to accumulate meaning. A photo of her son at graduation. A thank you card from a patient who'd made it through ARDS. The unit patch she kept sewn inside her jacket lining, the one she never wore where anyone could see it, the one that was older than some of the residents working this hospital. She didn't see Webb again. Didn't see him wake. Didn't see his vitals stabilize or his family arrive or the moment someone told him that a night shift nurse with scarred hands had shoved a needle between his ribs and given him a second life at 0247 hours on a Thursday morning in Raleigh. She just carried the box to her car and sat in the parking lot while the rain continued, patient and persistent, washing away the smell of the hospital, washing away the adrenaline, washing away everything except the knowledge that she'd done the only thing possible, and that it had cost her exactly everything. The needle was moving before Sterling's hand made contact with her shoulder. Sarah's arm rotated inward with the economical precision of someone who'd performed this procedure in conditions that would have made sterile technique a luxury, in field hospitals lit by chemical light sticks, on soldiers bleeding into body cavities while mortars fell like rain. She didn't acknowledge Sterling's voice. The words were background noise. The cardiac monitor was what she heard. The patient was what she saw. Webb's pressure had collapsed to 62 systolic. The pericardial sac had filled with fluid after the pulmonary embolism migrated, and now his heart was being crushed from the outside by its own protective membrane. Pulsus paradoxus on the monitor. Beck's triad, textbook presentation, and Sterling had missed it because Sterling saw a Ranger General and thought about hospital liability instead of tissue perfusion. Sarah moved to the bedside with Webb's chart in one hand, 14-gauge spinal needle in the other. The attending physician was still standing frozen near the monitor, his hands open at his sides like he was waiting for someone to tell him what came next. "Step back," Sarah said. Not a request. A statement of fact, delivered with the kind of calm that made the attending move without question. The needle puncture site marked the space where the fourth rib met the xiphoid process, anatomical landmark she'd learned in classrooms and perfected in combat zones where morphine was rationed and shock could kill faster than the actual wound. Her left hand found the intercostal space while her right hand steadied the needle. One breath. Muscle memory took over. The kind of muscle memory that came from holding a 7-year-old boy's intestines inside his body while mortars turned the street to powder, from running 3 miles through Marjah with his weight against her chest and blood running down her hands, from knowing exactly how much pressure a body could survive. The needle pierced the pericardium. Negative pressure tugged at the plunger. Sarah's jaw remained absolutely level. Her hands didn't tremble. The pale amber fluid began draining into the syringe, 50 milliliters of fluid that had been slowly suffocating Webb's heart, slowly stealing his cardiac output. 50 milliliters that felt like the entire universe compressing into 20 seconds. Webb's pressure climbed. 68, 74, 82. The cardiac monitor shifted its rhythm from the chaotic desperado pulse back toward something that resembled a normal sinus pattern. His oxygen saturation rose like someone pulling him up from underwater, 84%, 87%, 91%. Sarah withdrew the needle with the same measured motion she'd used to insert it, and Webb's heart responded by settling into a rhythm that sounded like rescue. The attending physician exhaled a breath he'd been holding for 6 minutes. One of the nurses was pressing a hand to her mouth. Webb's family in the corner of the trauma bay had gone rigid, watching the numbers on the monitor stabilize like they were witnessing resurrection. Sarah placed the syringe on the instrument tray without ceremony. She didn't look at Sterling, who was still standing 2 feet away with his hand half extended toward her shoulder, that hand now falling slowly back to his side because the procedure was finished and the patient was alive and there was nothing left to interrupt. "Get him stabilized," Sarah said to the attending. 2 units whole blood, for fluids at 250 per hour, and watch his pericardial output. If the fluid returns, call the cardiothoracic surgeon. The words came out with the kind of authority that made the attending nod and start moving, made 2 nurses spring toward the blood warmer, made the respiratory therapist adjust the ventilator settings without asking why. But Sterling wasn't frozen anymore. Sterling was moving with the precision of a man whose carefully constructed position had just developed a crack he couldn't immediately repair. His jaw had gone tight. His eyes had narrowed. And Sarah understood in that moment that the pericardiocentesis, the clinical perfection of it, the way she'd performed an advanced emergency procedure without hesitation or error, that had just confirmed something Sterling had suspected but couldn't quite prove. That had just shown the entire night shift that Sarah Chen was not a middle-aged nurse asking questions about billing codes. Sterling pulled his phone from his pocket at 0302 hours. The timing was precise. Sarah heard it vibrate once, twice, 3 times as he stepped into the hallway, and she understood what was happening the same way she understood cardiac physiology, not through observation but through recognition. He was activating. He was calling. He was going to burn down everything because she'd just exceeded the scope of her own story and he couldn't have that. At 0305 hours, Sterling reached the hospital board president at home. There was an unusual incident. A night shift nurse had performed an unauthorized procedure. There were significant gaps in her employment history. She'd operated outside her scope of practice. There needed to be an investigation. He had concerns about her credentials. He'd recommend contacting the temp agency that had placed her. The board president was awake now, reaching for a notepad, and Sterling was providing details. Sarah Chen, night shift, new hire, worked 3 previous facilities for remarkably short tenures, hadn't reported her actions through proper channels, had overridden physician authority in a critical moment. By 03:20 hours, the board president was calling the hospital's chief of staff. By 03:40 hours, the chief of staff was calling the temp agency's compliance officer. At 04:55 hours, Sterling was on the phone with an outside investigator based in Charlotte. There had been credential verification issues. There were gaps in her military service record that suggested possible fabrication. He was deeply concerned. He wanted to ensure the hospital's legal protection. There should be an immediate personnel review. The investigator said he could be there by 0800 hours. Sarah stayed with Webb for 3 more hours, monitoring his output, adjusting his medications, watching his oxygen saturation hold steady at 94%. She didn't check her phone. She didn't think about Sterling. She thought about a boy with terrified eyes in a city where the streets ran with dust and blood, a boy whose name she'd learned when the evacuation helicopter finally arrived, Marcus Webb, 7 years old, intestines wrapped inside his 7-year-old body by a woman's hands that would never forget the exact texture of holding someone together while the world tried to pull him apart. At 0900 hours, a hospital security supervisor appeared at the staff locker room while Sarah was hanging her jacket on its hook for the last time. The supervisor carried a cardboard box and a termination letter printed on hospital letterhead. There had been a personnel review. There were questions about credential verification. There were concerns about her employment history. Effective immediately, her employment was terminated for failure to follow chain of command, insubordination, and suspicious gaps in her employment record requiring further investigation. Sarah took one measured breath while the supervisor emptied her locker. The jacket came off the hook. The unit patch sewn inside the lining, the 75th Ranger Regiment insignia stitched so carefully that it would never tear, descended into the cardboard box. Sarah's hands remained absolutely still. "The patient in ICU 4, Sarah said. "Is he stable?" The supervisor's eyes shifted away. "You're no longer authorized for patient information." By 09:47 hours, Sarah sat in her car in the parking lot with the cardboard box on the passenger seat. The rain had started again, the same patient rain that had followed her from childhood through 3 combat tours and into this suspended life where she was neither active duty nor civilian, neither military nor nurse, neither the woman who'd run through Marjah with a child's body in her arms nor the woman who'd performed a pericardiocentesis at 03:02 hours to save that same man's life 20 years later. The gaps in her employment history existed because a Black Ops extraction had gone so catastrophically wrong that the Navy had ordered her name erased from every official record. Senior Chief Petty Officer Sarah Chen had been dissolved into the bureaucratic void, her security clearance retroactively nullified, her service record marked classified and then deleted entirely. She'd been given money and an assumption, disappear into the civilian world and never surface. She had held that boy's intestines inside his body while mortars turned buildings to rubble. She had memorized his face because she knew it was the only way to make sure he stayed alive. If she forgot him, he would die. That was how it worked. Soldiers died when you forgot their faces. She'd never forgotten. She'd carried him through 3 miles of hell and into a helicopter and then into 20 years of silence. At 1400 hours, Sarah sat in the VA hospital waiting room filling out intake forms that asked questions she couldn't legally answer. She was surrounded by veterans with wounds carved into their bodies and their eyes, a Marine with a prosthetic leg, a sailor with burn scars running up his neck, a soldier who wouldn't make eye contact with anyone. The intake form asked for military service dates. Branch of service. Rank. Discharge status. Sarah left every line blank. A young Marine caught her staring at his 75th Ranger Regiment tattoo. The same unit. The same patch that was sewn into her jacket lining in a cardboard box in her car. "You serve?" he asked. Sarah took one measured breath. The lie moved through her mouth like something natural, something she'd rehearsed 1,000 times. "No." But that afternoon at 1530 hours, her phone rang. Unknown number. Military protocol, never answer. But something in Sarah's chest that had been wound tight since 03:02 hours loosened just enough to let her thumb find the answer button. Security escorted her through the hallway at 08 for 7 hours. 2 officers flanking. One carried a cardboard box. The other carried her hospital badge on a lanyard, already deactivated, the magnetic strip recorded and filed and erased from every door lock in Oak Creek Memorial. Her name was already gone from the staff roster. Her access codes already revoked. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead like they always did, but today they sounded like a funeral dirge, each hum another second of her life being systematically erased from the place where she'd kept people alive for the last 4 months. The day shift nurses watched her pass. The one she'd trained. The one she'd corrected at 3 in the morning when they were about to make a medication error that would have killed someone. They didn't look at her. One turned away. Another suddenly became very interested in a computer monitor. The silence that followed Sarah down that corridor was the sound of institutional cowardice, people who knew what she'd done, who knew why she'd been fired, and who valued their jobs more than her truth. At the nurse's station, Dr. Sterling stood with his arms crossed. Feet apart. Power stance. His face arranged into an expression of satisfied control, the kind of smile that a man makes when he's won a game nobody else knew they were playing. He watched her pass like a predator watching prey finally fall into its death throes. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. His presence said everything. You challenged me. You lost. The tremor in Sarah's chest wasn't fear. It was the controlled rage of someone who'd survived worse than a cafeteria humiliation and a termination letter written by a coward. The termination letter had arrived at 0620 hours. Single-spaced. Formal. The language was calculated to sound procedural, bureaucratic, unassailable. Termination of employment, effective immediately. Reason, failure to follow chain of command protocols in emergency medical situations and suspicious gaps in employment history requiring further investigation. The letter didn't mention the pericardiocentesis. Didn't mention General Webb's stabilized sinus rhythm. Didn't mention that Sarah had performed an emergency procedure without Sterling's authorization because Sterling had been wrong and Webb would have died under standard protocol. The letter cited chain of command as though following a superior's orders into medical malpractice was somehow the ethical choice. As though saving a patient's life was insubordination. The gaps in her employment history were the real problem. The letter hinted at them like they were evidence of fraud. What it couldn't say, what Sterling couldn't possibly understand, was that those gaps existed because Senior Chief Petty Officer Sarah Chen had been part of a Black Ops extraction team in Helmand Province, specifically in the Marjah district, that had gone catastrophically wrong on a Tuesday morning in 2004. The extraction had been for a high-value target. It had ended with the target dead, 2 team members wounded, and Sarah carrying a 7-year-old boy 3 miles through enemy fire while mortars fell around them like rain. The Navy had officially erased that mission from every database. The Department of Defense had sealed her service record. A direct order, classified, unsigned, delivered through unofficial channels, had instructed Senior Chief Chen to disappear into civilian life and never speak of what happened in that valley. So the gaps in her employment history weren't gaps at all. They were classified operations that the government had decided never occurred. They were lives she'd saved in places that didn't exist on maps. They were 15 years of service to a country that had asked her to forget she'd ever served. Sterling's letter called them suspicious. By 0847 hours, Sarah was walking out of the hospital with everything she owned in a cardboard box. Her stethoscope. Her trauma shears with SCO2 engraved on the handle, her call sign from the team's senior chief officer, now just letters that meant nothing to anyone who read them. Her clinical notes from the night shift, classified and marked for destruction according to hospital policy. And at the bottom of the box, wrapped in a spare pair of scrubs, the faded denim jacket she'd kept folded in her locker for 4 months. The 75th Ranger Regiment patch was sewn inside the lining, invisible unless someone knew to look for it. A reminder. A secret. A truth she couldn't say out loud. She didn't look back at Sterling as she walked past the nurse's station. Not a glance. Not acknowledgement. Her eyes stayed forward, her shoulders level, her breathing steady. The only thing she let him see was the back of her head and the careful, measured pace of someone who had learned a long time ago that showing pain was the same as showing blood to predators. Sterling wanted a reaction. He wanted her to tremble. He wanted tears or anger or the kind of breaking that would confirm he'd won not just a bureaucratic victory but a moral one. She gave him nothing. Not because she was stronger than him, but that wasn't the point. She gave him nothing because giving him nothing was how she would survive what came next. The parking lot was grey. Raleigh sky the color of dirty concrete. The walk from the employee entrance to her truck took 90 seconds. She counted them without meaning to. Her hands that had held people's intestines inside their bodies while mortars fell, hands that had started fours on soldiers who were already dead but didn't know it yet, hands that had performed a perfect pericardiocentesis at 0302 hours to save a man whose face she'd recognize anywhere, stayed steady as she set the cardboard box on the passenger seat. She didn't go home. Not directly. There were forms she needed to fill out. Medical appointments she couldn't put off. Questions that needed answering from people who had no idea what they were asking. By 14:30 hours, Sarah was sitting in a plastic chair in the VA hospital waiting room, 30 miles south of Oak Creek Memorial, surrounded by men whose faces carried the weight of wars that had aged them 20 years in 5. The walls were beige. The fluorescent lights hummed the same funeral dirge. The coffee in the corner was old enough to have developed its own ecosystem. The intake form was on her lap. Single sheet. 12 questions. Service branch, deployment history, dates of active duty, discharge status. Her pen hovered over the first line. Service branch. The words caught in her throat before they could reach her fingers. She couldn't write Navy. She couldn't write Special Operations. She couldn't write the truth because the truth had been officially erased, and writing it would be a federal crime under the Classification Act. She wrote honorable discharge, medical documentation on file with Department of Defense. It wasn't an answer. It was a wall. The receptionist glanced at the form when Sarah turned it in. Looked at the blank spaces. Looked at Sarah's face. Didn't ask questions. In the VA system, blank spaces and deflections were language everyone understood. Everyone in that room was holding secrets that the government had ordered them to carry in silence. Everyone in that room had service records that didn't match their scars. Sarah waited for hours to see a psychiatrist. Dr. Reeves, a woman who had her own set of classified credentials according to the credential plate on her door. They sat in a small room that smelled like antiseptic and old carpet. Dr. Reeves didn't ask about the gaps in the intake form. She asked about sleep. About nightmares. About whether Sarah had hurt herself or anyone else. And Sarah answered truthfully about the things the government allowed her to acknowledge and deflected on everything else: the extraction in Helmand Province, the 7-year-old boy, the 3 miles of enemy fire, the Navy's decision to make that entire chapter of her life cease to exist. The gaps in your service record, Dr. Reeves said carefully, are sometimes related to special assignment work. Sarah didn't confirm. Didn't deny. Just met the doctor's eyes and saw the recognition of someone who'd been trained to know which questions would never be answered. Are you safe? Dr. Reeves asked instead. Sarah thought about General Marcus Webb. About whether he would wake up. About whether he would remember that the woman who saved his life was named Sarah. About the fact that she could never tell him. About the fact that if Webb discovered her identity, if he connected her to the boy he'd been, the government would come for her immediately under the classified order she'd lived under for 2 decades. The order that said, "You are dead. You were never here. You will live as a civilian and speak of nothing you saw." Yes, Sarah said. I'm safe. It was the most dangerous lie she'd ever told. By 1800 hours, she was sitting in her truck in the VA hospital parking lot, watching the sun go grey behind the trees. Rain started at 1815 hours, the kind of rain that hammered the windshield like tiny accusations. She sat with her hands on the steering wheel and didn't drive. The cardboard box sat on the passenger seat, her entire career contained in 12 square inches of craft paper. Her phone was on the seat beside the box. She had 17 unread messages. 12 from former colleagues asking if she was okay. One from the temp agency that had placed her. From numbers she didn't recognize, probably debt collection agencies or hospitals checking references that no longer existed. She answered none of them. Her son Daniel had called twice. She called him back at 18:47 hours. He was at the high school, still in chemistry class, but he answered on the first ring like he'd been waiting. "Mom." His voice was tight. "Scared. I heard you got fired. Angie's mom works at the hospital and she told Angie that Dr. Sterling said you violated patient privacy, Anne." "I saved someone's life," Sarah said quietly. "Sterling didn't like it. That's all that matters. But he can't just." "He can. He did. We'll figure it out." Daniel was quiet for 3 seconds. In those 3 seconds, Sarah knew her son was doing what he'd learned to do from living with a mother who never explained gaps in her history, who came home with scars she wouldn't discuss, who sometimes woke up speaking a language that wasn't English and pretended it hadn't happened. He was learning to live with truths he wasn't allowed to question. "I love you, Mom," he said. "I know," Sarah said. "Be kind to people who need it. That's all anyone can do." She hung up and started the truck. The rain came down harder, each drop hitting the windshield with percussion like Morse code, like a message written in a language only survivors understood. She had no job. She had no official identity as a medical professional. She had employment gaps that couldn't be explained. She had a service record that didn't legally exist. She had a son whose future was suddenly uncertain. And she had a cardboard box containing everything that proved who she really was, if anyone ever had the clearance to ask. Sterling had tried to destroy her by making her disappear. He just didn't understand that she'd been invisible for 20 years already. He'd just accelerated a process that was already complete. The only difference was that now, without the hospital, without the night shift, without the procedural excuse to be awake while everyone else slept, she had nothing left to hide behind. The question was whether the people who'd erased her would let her stay erased, or whether saving General Marcus Webb's life, the boy from Marjah, the 7-year-old whose face she'd recognize anywhere, would be enough to bring them out of the darkness looking for her. She didn't have long to wonder. By tomorrow morning, her phone would ring with a call that changed everything. Not from Sterling. Not from the hospital. From someone in an office in the Pentagon who'd been monitoring her file for 20 years, just waiting for her to slip up. Just waiting for a moment like this. For now, she drove through the rain toward a future she couldn't see, carrying secrets that would either save her or destroy her, knowing that the worst part wasn't being invisible. The worst part was knowing why she'd been made that way in the first place. Hit like and subscribe if you're enjoying this. And I'm always curious, drop a comment and tell us if you're watching from a big city or a small town. Now let's continue the story.